So, treating something like a landfill or wastewater treatment plant as a source of revenue beyond just dumping stuff on the side of a hill, that's good garbage.
Hello. Welcome to the Good Garbage Podcast. My name is Ved Krishna. My primary reason for existence has been to find ways to leave our wonderful planet cleaner. We will be speaking with material innovators, creators, and propagators to learn from them how we can build for scale and towards a regenerative future. Their stories will help us answer the big question, what is good garbage? There is so much amazing work that can emerge when there are smart and driven people in the government with the resources at their disposal. I got to learn so much through this conversation with Bill Orts, the research leader for bioproducts at US Department of Agriculture. Bill's job is to find more value-added solutions from agri-residues to add to the possibilities of wealth creation for those in the chain. Bill is a lifelong proponent of fermentation and PHAs, and we get to learn so much from him, not just about PHAs, but also of various other substrates from celluloses to PLA. He has co-written over 150 peer-reviewed journal articles and won numerous awards. Bill is a wealth of knowledge with complete readiness to share. I am for sure a better person thanks to this interaction and hope many get impacted similarly. Enjoy the conversation. Hello. So happy, Bill, that you could join us today for our show. Bill, of course, you're the research leader at USDA-ARS, and we're going to get much more into that long abbreviation. But thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Great. So we were digging into you as a person first, and we hardly found anything. So you're clearly not on the social media. So tell us more about your story and, where you grew up and the influences that you had that probably shaped what you do today.
That's a great question. So influences, been interested in the environment all my life. So I was trained as a biochemical engineer with the idea that ethanol and other things were going to be our solution for environmental issues. And it grew to be a lot more than that. So my background is in bioplastics with the company Xerox that was trying to make biodegradable plastics in the 80s as a replacement for synthetic plastic. So Xerox and ICI and Zeneca and Monsanto had collaborations to make bioplastics, polyhydroxyalkylate bioplastics. And could they make them cost competitive? So that was my PhD thesis with Xerox back in the 80s and 90s to replace synthetic commodity plastics using natural ingredients.
Yeah, I was really surprised to see, Bill, how early on you were on that bandwagon, because I only got to know about PHA once Danimer came into existence and PNG and that trajectory started. So tell me more about these early days. What was it? What excited you to get into biochemistry first? And then, of course, get into bioplastics from there.
Really, that I think that nature provides the answers. And so anytime you introduce a synthetic chemical into the world, it's an experiment on the world. Whereas nature has provided these molecules, so nature has learned to adapt to these molecules. There's evolution, there's ways to degrade them, to use them as a food source. So every synthetic chemical, good, bad, or in between, is an experiment. It's a new thing. So when possible, use a natural product to answer some of our needs. So we can have a modern lifestyle still using natural products. That was a big driver.
And how did you get to fermentation strategies? That's a big jump between, nature doesn't do synthetic chemistry, but then, how do you arrive at a place where you're fermenting stuff?
So PHA is a small miracle. It's like fat in the human body. When soil bacteria are about to run out of something important, they store all the carbons into polyhydroxyalkanoates, this bioplastic, and it is a small miracle. So you have a soil bacteria about to go dormant. It will take all the excess carbons, make a PHA polyester, and that polyester looks a lot like polypropylene. but the same bacteria that produce it also can eat it, almost like, humans eat fat, plants eat starch. So nature can make this plastic, nature can consume it. It's part of the big biocycle. It's very propelling. And if you see samples of it, you can see that it can meet a lot of its needs. So I am a PHA lifer from the 80s, 90s, and kind of managed to work at it in my whole career in some way or another.
So who was it who originally found PHA? Because my story just goes back to PNG and not before that. So it seems
Yeah.
like it was before that. So tell us the history of PHA. Who found it? How did it evolve? And because I didn't even know it was a thing in the 80s.
Yeah, and it was the 60s and 70s. A guy named Joe Merrick. My PhD supervisor was also an officer eventually at Xerox. That's how that Xerox link happened. A guy named Bob Marchessault, a famous cellulose chemist originally, figuring out the structure of cellulose, all natural products, had a really vast career. And he came across at Syracuse University a guy named Joe Merrick, who was trying to figure out why bacteria would produce this polyester. And then what was it? Why was it there? And what could you use it for? And then this guy, Bob Marchessault at Syracuse, who eventually went to Xerox, said you can use it for a lot of things. And so in the 80s, 90s, and O's, we were making all sorts of products with Procter & Gamble and Metabolics and a bunch of big companies, shampoo bottles, paper coatings, inks, all sorts of items that you would use in a photocopier, as well as in consumer products. So it was a group at Syracuse, a group at McGill, and then Xerox, and then probably many of the major multinationals have had a say in PHA. They've tried. So it's got a very long lifetime, well before Danimer. Monsanto and DuPont and Dow and the list, Procter & Gamble. IBM even touched on it for a bit. Xerox definitely. So it's got a long life. And it's always that you can't quite meet the price point that you can meet for a commodity plastic unless your feedstocks are nearly free. So we can get into that. So we've spent the last 10 years looking at reducing feedstock costs. That's the big one.
So what happened in the middle? Like you were talking about these, and then we jump, and suddenly it becomes hot again in the 2015-ish kind of domain. Danimer comes in a little bit before that, and then of course RWDC, and now CJ Bio, and Blue PHA, and there's a whole range of people suddenly very, very active on it. Is it just the scenario with the regulations and awareness growing? So let me break it into two parts. Why was Xerox originally motivated to do work in this area when there was petrochemicals available at a cheaper price, probably functionally, I don't know this, but maybe better, and there's not that much push on sustainability? And then what happens in the middle that it kind of nobody talks about it, and then suddenly it becomes hot again?
That is a great question. And some of it is the big multinationals maybe lost patience, some of the bigger companies. So Xerox, if you can't get an answer in so many quarters rather than years, and you can't meet the points. So if you were to ask me in 1995 or 1998, Monsanto had a big push and they hit pretty well every target with PHAs. We met the group, we'd get excited, go all the big national meetings, American Chemical Society, and Monsanto would be in the front row presenting incredible data, how they managed to take the genes from a micro, put it into plants and make products, and Monsanto nailed it. And then they lost patience. It was kind of like one of those strokes of midnight, moments where you're like, what just happened? Monsanto, had a team of 30 people and now not. That was a biggie. That technology, you can find out where it went, where the IP went. Some of the plant IP may have gone to Metabolics and they had a plant group. So if you ask me, what was the future of PHA in 1995? Great future. You've got all these multinationals carrying and on it. Procter & Gamble was the next P&G, and they were literally making Tide bottles out of PHAs in the early O's. There was a guy named Frank Noda there, and the product line was Nodax. That name is truly linked. He was the inventor, so that to honor him, the whole product line was called Nodax. And Procter & Gamble was making everything under the sun and then lost patience. So again, you have this, if you're going to be a PHA lifer, kill me now moments where like, okay, we have made it. This is the future of plastics. You've got Monsanto, you've got Procter & Gamble, you've got, a company like Zeneca, ICI, all on board. And then what happened? And then I'm not in the boardrooms. I don't know what happened, when Procter & Gamble killed it off maybe 20 years ago, just under 20 years. The patent literature was rich, and then it just died one afternoon, perhaps, in a boardroom. Who knows? And so the next wave was, kind of Danimer. We've been with Mango since the beginning. Our strategic partners, really good friends. We love Mango. They're in our basement still. So we met them when they were 2 people, and they moved into our building when they were 2 and 3 people. Yeah, Anne, Molly, Allison, and a few others. We love their story. We will support them. Okay, so USDA, our role is to try to help companies do the right thing, whatever that is. And we have a mission in this field to help companies kind of do the right thing and move technology forward. And we'll do what we can to help companies get there, including provide resources and partnerships and a little bit of networking to help folks connect the dots.
And it was so lovely to have Molly on the show, actually. And we talked a lot about, because I didn't know she was using methane, and that was really impressive on how they were going about it. Because I had visited RWDC a couple of times, and obviously it was vegetable oil and it was very interesting. But I had no clue that the bacteria would also consume methane and create something similar magic, as you said in the beginning.
So at the risk of name dropping, so one of their chief employees now is a guy named Jeff Nobes. So he and I have the same background at Xerox. He followed me in the same position as in the PHA project. And then he came to USDA and worked with us for 4 or 5 years on PHA. Well, we worked on other biopolymers. And then he's been at a few places, and now he's a PHA lifer back to RWDC. So Jeff Nobes is a big player in the field quietly. And you're right, neither of us necessarily have a big social media presence. We try to kind of work in the background. USDA, I understand why I work in the background, because we can't really take things to market. We just can kind of try to influence people, try to influence policy, make sense of things. So quietly, we've helped a lot of companies. If you look at the patent literature, we're there. We can brag about our successes, but it's not our job to market our success. It's kind of like just help companies, take off where they can. And we have many stories on that. The other thing that has been a big driver, okay, so you asked what happened in the O's. So the big companies, the really, really big multinationals lost patience, whatever word you say. Okay, Procter & Gamble and a few others. So then the smaller ones, metabolic and kept at it, Danimer. The other thing that happened that has been the new wave is biorefinery development. And this, and they're all intertwined. So another part of our research starting 20 years ago was, what do you do beyond corn ethanol? Okay, so corn ethanol is a Midwest thing in the US. Okay, so you have corn mills, you have excess corn syrup, you want to make ethanol. So roughly 10% of our fuel supply in the US is corn ethanol. Our group, 1/3 of what we do was develop the biorefineries that are going to be advanced biofuels. So what do you do with wheat straw, rice straw, corn stover, all the other food waste? Can you turn it into ethanol? Was our original play 20 years ago. We probably did everything but that because it's so complicated. And the reason building a biorefinery from scratch is complicated beyond a corn-based ethanol is you're asking for 2 kind of miracles. You're asking for the conversion technology to take rice straw or wheat straw and get sugars and turn it into ethanol. That's kind of a small miracle that hasn't been done at a huge scale. And then you're trying to develop a whole new biorefinery from scratch, the supply chain, the capital, the machinery. And so the corn ethanol industry already had the mills, the corn mills. So what we've been doing for the last 15 years is, what would a biorefinery look like that answers all the questions that goes beyond corn ethanol? So to jump ahead, what we came up with, and cellulosic ethanol from scratch is hard, is build off existing structures like a landfill or a lumber mill or a wastewater treatment facility. And so when Mango showed up and said, we can take waste methane from a wastewater treatment facility or a landfill and turn it into a bioplastic, they had us on hello. That is like, okay, now that's the piece of the biorefinery. You could use that methane and run electrical generators. You can take the fibers off that landfill and you can, recollect the fibers and potentially turn it into ethanol or recycled paper. But you can turn anything into methane, and you can turn methane into electricity or bioplastics and beyond. They had us on hello.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. I'm going to take one step back and then I'll move on. I know I'm kind of stuck with the Monsantos and the Bayers of the world. But whenever we think of these companies, we think of them so petroleum reliant. So why would they explore so early on? Was it certain properties and not just wanting to go more sustainable? Were there certain properties that were coming from PA which were quote unquote superior, different from what they were getting from petrochemicals? Because it still intrigues me on why a company which is okay with what they're using would explore something so different. My presumption is there has to be some catch to it. So what would that be?
So I'll slightly answer the question you didn't ask. So as a prime example, DuPont, roughly 25 years ago, had a mandate that 25% of their feedstocks would be natural feedstocks, 25% within 10 years. And they didn't necessarily hit that target, or who knows how they did. But going back, if you went to meetings and DuPont would show up with their representatives, they were going to make nylons, and they did. They made a thing called Sorona, natural textiles. So they're going to make natural textiles, rug materials, and plastics. So you can see why DuPont, if they had that mandate, and they had it for years, you could see why they would go after PHAs. So PHAs is a general class to see, go to the chemistries of it. The more complex you feed the bacteria, the more complex the feedstock is, the more complex the polymer becomes. So if you feed it really clean, sucrose, glucose, you will get mostly PHB, mostly. Okay, you can genetically modify that, but originally it was easy to get this PHB short side chain. It crystallizes and it becomes a polymer that is a little bit like really brittle, polyethylene or something. It's kind of like cracks when you break it. Part of the breakthrough is where you could get a range of properties. You could make copolymers of that, or you can get additives onto that, and you could get every property under the sun. But as you change the properties, it became more expensive or slower. And this is some of the breakthroughs RWDC had over the last 10 years, is they could make some of these copolymers and not necessarily have it be more expensive or slower. So part of the patience is polyhydroxybutyrate is the main PHA, and it's too crystalline for its own good. What that means is it crystallizes too quickly. Its melting point is roughly, 170, but it starts to degrade at 185. So you have this little processing temperature where, just as soon as you start to melt it, you start to burn it. And that's been both, so you can make beautiful materials from it. You can make copolymers that have beautiful clear films, but you worry about degradation. So everyone is intrigued. If you see the textiles that some of these companies are making, you're really, really intrigued, but you're worried about ironing it. If you take the hot iron to it, will it melt under the iron or start to burn? So all of those have been addressed, but slowly. And in the middle of all that, you have polypropylene at, $1.10 a kilo, right? And okay, how are we going to compete with that when we're still at a fledgling industry? Yeah.
Just for knowledge's sake, can you, and for me and the listeners, can you break it down? When you say PHA and you just talk about PHB, we hear PHBV, and maybe there are others. So what are these variants? And like you mentioned about PHB, what is the real difference between these and how do they act?
So in the 80s and 90s, and there was a very well-known, the Japanese government went at this in a big way as well. A big center, Rikon, run by a guy named Yoshi Doi. So the very first polymer really characterized the most characterized was hydroxybutyrate, single carbon off the side, crystallizes easily. The next discovery is almost by accident. If you don't have pure sugar in your fermenter, if you have acids, you can start to get side groups and they mimic the acid you fed it. So if you have a fatty acid and it seems to go in pairings. So if you feed oils or fatty acids and they have, 10 carbons, you can get, the side group can have 10, 8, and 6 or so carbons. And when you do that, you don't get it as crystalline and it starts to get, more rubbery, but maybe you don't necessarily get clear films. So early on, ICI was found out, they were starting to feed dirtier sugars to their bacteria. This is in the 80s. And instead of getting HB, hydroxybutyrate with one carbon, they started getting 1 and 2 carbon mixes. And the copolymers of that at roughly 15 to 25% HB, so 2 carbons instead of 1, ends up as beautiful stretchy films. And you can make clear, beautiful stretchy films. That was kind of like and the melting point goes from 170 down to 150 and 140, and it starts to behave like polypropylene and polyethylene. And that is the gold, there's the gold standard right there. And so they got to nearly perfect right in the 90s, early 90s. Some blends of copolymers, will be a natural product that can replace polypropylene. And that was kind of the belief by 1995. What's going to stop it?
But what is the difference, like in terms of the different kinds that you mentioned?
Yeah, so you can range from a clear film that would look a lot like saran wrap. Then you can add longer side groups and have it be less crystalline, and it can end up being, and you can cross-link those, so you can get up being some kind of polyester that's stretchable and more rubbery. So you can really hit most of the temperature space and most of the mechanical property space with an HB, with some kind of PHA copolymer or copolymer blend. And some folks blend it with PLA, some just wait for, get the microbes to make the perfect blend. So you can dial in the properties and you can mostly match. Now, thermal stability, thermal question and thermal processing has been harder to reach. It's been reached, okay? So some of these companies like an RWDC can and Mango's making beautiful samples of textiles. Hasn't been reached at scale, it's getting there. And it hasn't been reached at the price points at the speed in which the multinationals wanted it to, I guess. And maybe that's why they lost patience. You can make a beautiful shampoo bottle, you can make a beautiful textile. Can't necessarily match the polyesters, but that at price and product range. I'm going to answer a different question you asked a few minutes ago. The reasons for doing it, the drivers behind these have changed over the decades. It may have been as simple as, okay, it's nice to add value to all these waste products or, and make sure you're using all the corn syrup you have available. Another issue back in the 90s and 00s was litter. Okay, let's just do it because we're going to reduce our litter. That's a great marketing thing. And certain folks wanted to buy a product that was more natural and would not create a litter nuisance. Then carbon capture and sequestering came into the picture, and sustainability. And so the drivers and even some policy about carbon capture and carbon sequestering came in. So the drivers for doing this have changed over the decades, and we've tried to make sense of that.
So what about, and you just mentioned PLA. So let's compare PLA and PHA and the real kind of differences. And of course, there are many, but not just from a product standpoint, but even from a creation process standpoint, when you look at both our fermentation, but they're still different. So can you break that down for us too?
Yeah. So PHA is made fully in the cell, in the microbe or in the plant cell. All right. So whatever makes a PHA makes the full molecule and then keeps it within the cell membrane. And then you have to isolate that, and that adds some costs. You have to separate it from the microbial stew somehow. Polylactic acid is kind of like, as the name suggests, is you can ferment to lactic acid quite readily. All right. And companies like Cargill got really, really good at it. And there's stereochemistry in it. So what they got really, really good at is making lactic acid that's got all the same stereochemistry, like really pure stuff. So the carbon can come off either side. And why that makes sense is when you eventually make a polymer out of lactic acid and all of it's the same, the same lactic acid, you make a polymer with all of the side groups coming off the same side. And then it crystallizes really, really well. All right. So arguably, PLA is more of a synthetic polymer. PHA is completely natural. And those differences are fairly big and noticeable if you're going to use the word synthetic. which is literally a matter of definition. And the difference is PHAs are natural, and the same microbes and the enzymatic pathway that makes them, those enzymes and pathways can consume it. All right, arguably. So it is literally a natural food that's been out there, and evolution has dealt with it. By happenstance, PLA is similar enough to PHA, and we've done studies on this, that the same enzymes that degrade PHAs can degrade PLA, but it wasn't a perfect natural fit. There wasn't millennia of evolution that says those are the exact enzymes. So we have a friend who likens it to, the bacteria can eat PHA like they eat ice cream and steak and everything they love. PLA is like the broccoli you don't like or something, or the, Brussels sprouts. We can eat it if we have to. It's not the exact match, and they can. So it's the enzymes haven't necessarily evolved over the millennia to eat it as quickly or consume it, break it down, but they work. So PLA also breaks down. But the difference also in synthesis is the manufacturers of PLA have a lot more control in the chemical process of molecular weight size, how, stereoregular, how perfect you want to make it, how crystalline you want to make it. You have that in the synthesis step rather than in the fermenter, where you have to do it less directly than in chemical synthesis. Chemical synthesis is direct, and you have a lot of controls. Fermentation synthesis is less direct.
How much of a role does feedstock play? So we mentioned a little bit on vegetable oil, methane, and of course, using starches. And then I'm seeing a lot of projects that are coming from sugarcane, molasses, towards PLA. So let's start on two different pockets. So let's talk about PHA and different feedstocks, and does that directly impact the molecular structure? And then PLA. So let's break down both of those.
All right. So the history, let's go way back to PHB, PHA production, right? Just mentioned it a few minutes ago. So as ICI was scaling up, they wanted to go, sugar beets and molasses kind of syrups. They didn't use pure sucrose, glucose, right? It started to get these, pollutants, acids and other things in there. And then they realized, maybe at first by accident, that they were making HBHV because they weren't using pure sugar feedstock, right? And in the United States, we would probably use corn syrup. And so to get to the copolymers, you'd either modify the bacteria, but you'd probably have a clean sugar source. So that's feedstock. So it was almost happy accident that at Zeneca, way back, ICI, I keep saying Zeneca, ICI was using a slightly dirty sugars. All right. Then you move ahead, and Brazilian sugarcane won't be the same as our corn syrup, in the United States, and it's going to give you slightly different products. And it shows in the end products, and you get more copolymers. It was a Dutch group, really, and that discovered you could use oils. All right, so it's bacteria oleovorans. The name oil is right in there, Pseudomonas oleovorans. We were like, oh wow, they eat oil, oleos, and they create PHAs from those oils. And you can get really complex. And if the more complex the fatty acid you eat, the oil, the more complex the polymer is. Direct cause and effect. And that's closer. Now, RWDC's kind of perfected that technology, or really brought it along. It was right around the 90s that the oil started to take place, to really expand. So that was a huge feedstock. Again, do you really want to take high-grade food oil, or are you trying to go towards low-grade, greases you would get off a wastewater treatment facility, plant, or something? And most people would rather take the brown, dirty greases, but that's harder. The polymers are pure if you can take really nice palm oil or something and make your plastics. Okay, and then methane, and that's been part of it, methane and fatty acid production. We also have a company we worked with that turned fatty acids directly to PHAs. They can be kind of smelly. And, mango story. Now let's go back to PLA. You can pretty well ferment almost a lot of feedstocks into lactic acid. All right. All these acids. So now doing it well, like Cargill did, was magic. And Total Corbion does. Okay. Making really good, clean lactic acid is a bit of an art form. And that's why they got a competitive edge. And then getting really good, clean lactic acid predictably, and then turning into polymers, a little bit of magic.
What about the structure itself? So you change the feedstock, you keep the same bacteria. Does the structure totally change, or is it could be similar?
So let's answer for PLA first. So PLA, there's three options. We talked about that stereochemistry. Carbons can come off one side, you can call it, the R polymer. Comes off the other side, you can call it the D polymer. You can have a mix of those and you get a non-crystalline polymer that's mostly like chewing gum and nobody wants it in general, unless you don't want a highly. So if you want a more rubberized one, so that there is product lines where you purposely don't make it highly crystalline and you make it more gummy and not as like a crisp plastic that will snap. So there's everything in between. You will lose the heat modification point as you lose crystallinity in PLA. So everybody's been looking for thermal stability. The cold cup. So the first thing is to, make a clear biodegradable cup out of PLA. And the downside of that, if you read the bottom, it says, don't put this thing in the microwave because it starts to soften almost exactly at 100 Celsius, right? So your boiling water and your cup starts to melt. And you can go online and you can see bad pictures of, bottles they've made and they put them in the microwave and they're melting. All right. So adding heat stability has been a big issue with PLA, and it's been solved. And it's been solved through stereochemistry tricks and additives. You can make PLA very heat stable. Now, one of the ones, and this is another small miracle, is remember we talked about the stereochemistry. You can have all R, you can have all D. Okay. If you take a blend of those two polymers, so you take 50-50 or 50% D, and you mix them together, you get a new crystal structure that is heat stable and really, really good. And there's patents out on that starting about 10-15 years ago. That blend adds heat stability. Now, it's not necessarily cheaper to make that blend, all right? So there's a lot more chemistry. So they haven't quite matched the price point of polypropylene. And remember, a lot of the monomers that are used in the petroleum industry are almost throwaway molecules. And they have, a $1 trillion head start. And they can kind of, in a true refinery, the first 80% of the barrel is going to go to gasoline or diesel and then jet fuel. Okay, kerosene, diesel. All right, so these last 10% are, let's find uses from road tar to, these molecules coming off either natural gas or in a petroleum barrel specifically. These are molecules that are off gases as part of as part of your distillation of your cracking. So the price points, you're just the petroleum industries try to optimize prices on everything, and they have a lot of wiggle. They can set prices more liberally than just a single company working on PHA. So heat stability was a big thing in the PLA mode. Let's get back down to your question, right? Heat stability and matching the product and price points in a commodity market. That's been a challenge. Or do you go outside a commodity market and look for people that are willing to pay a premium for these to be natural? And that's an open question.
And what about PHA though? So coming back to my question and my intrigue, what happens with feedstock change? So so if you had a similar bacteria and it was feeding on a certain, like you mentioned, it could be spent oil or it could be fresh oil. And what happens then? Does the product become totally different or similar? And the second thing you mentioned, and I was intrigued, was homogeneity. So homogeneity is much better in PLA, and then of course they are achieving it in PHA. And is that just a given that it will not be as homogeneous, or that's something that has evolved much further now?
So it's an interesting question. So separation, downstream processing after fermentation in both, lactic acid's been dealt with. Okay. In PHA, it is a challenge for everybody getting to scale and getting the purity. So there's both purity in feedstock and how it'll change properties. And then there's downstream processing. So you've asked kind of two questions in one there about purity. Okay. So you can have pure feedstocks and get very, very predictable end products. And but you still have to process them in PHA and get really, really clean end products in your processing as well. So there's some questions there. So where are we going with this? Some of the so let's talk about mango for a second. Methanotropes, the easy product to put out, the easiest one that they put out first was almost pure PHP. Okay, so methane, you can get pretty clean methane streams, and then you can get really, really pure PHP. So the question is, what do you do with that, and what's your end market for that, and how do you turn pure PHP into something useful, or do you want to modify your bacteria, your methanotropes, to put out something that isn't pure PHP? And that's what we've been working. So we have an slightly more academic side of our research with Mango to train those methanotropes, optimize them to potentially produce the copolymers that are so intriguing when you feed fatty acid, or so intriguing when you feed, a mix of sugars or acids. Yeah. So do we want to go into that question deeper? What's the rest of that question?
Now, it's just we can stop here, but basically the idea was that different feedstocks and the impact of those feedstocks on the final product.
Yeah, different feedstocks, definitely. And for the companies that are really on it, it's something they control really well. It's a cause and effect. So I'm sure if you ask RWDC what oil mix they need to get what properties, they can tell you that, right? It's not a big old mystery. And so that part of the mystery, is gone away. There's cause and effect. We get this, feedstock stream. So in our industry, going back to the idea of the biorefinery, in our industry, seasonality is an issue in our world. That's another question about the biorefinery concept that was going to be a small miracle. If you were going to build a biorefinery dependent on, say, rice straw from scratch, who's going to collect it? Who's going to store it? And what do you do if that rice straw changes, whether you picked it up from a wet field or a dry field? Who stores it? And what's the difference between straw in January versus June? It's a major question. So you do look for consistent feedstock that's going to be the same as best you can every day. That's also why we kind of look at putting this at a landfill or a wastewater treatment facility. I'm not going to say that garbage is the same every day, but there's a predictability at a landfill. So the truck that picks up the same route on a Wednesday afternoon, most of the year picks up the same stuff, right? So there's a consistency as a feedstock. Now, if you can find a processing, we work with a company that literally autoclaves the MSW to make a consistent output. So Hughes Energy, and the company originally that we worked with before that was called CR And you take garbage and you treat it like medical waste. Now, it does cost money, more than $25 a ton to do that. But if you're in a place where the tipping fees are that, you take garbage, you autoclave, steam pressurize it, you separate it, and you get very predictable output streams. You can recycle paper from there. You can get a high organic solid you can send to a digester. So you can turn what you think is a very non-homogeneous feedstock into homogeneous, predictable. Now, predictable on a regular basis, so like predictable output streams that you can use. So we have produced PHAs from streams that we get from garbage, not necessarily methane. So you can get the cellulosics, you can get the high organic waste, you can turn it into fatty acids, or you can turn it into PHAs.
I'm reversing the question. Say the same vegetable oil, but different bacteria. So can you have different kinds of bacteria acting and creating a different structure?
Absolutely. Early on, so, I started as a microbiologist way back in my wasted youth. There were only certain types of bacteria, soil bacteria, that did this. And the dream was eventually, let's take this genetic engine and put it into E. coli, because we understand E. coli, or can we put it into yeast and fungus? And then, so it's kind of settled out. So there's a whole science in optimizing the microbes. And there's genetic engineering you can do, or you can just do natural selection. Mango does a bit of both. They're the ones we know about, that we have the academic partnership with now. So you can genetically modify them, or you can look for natural selections. And the third thing you can do that modifies the end use is you can have mixed cultures, and all are in play. So you can say, okay, one of these cultures loves to produce PHB. The other one loves to produce, a slightly longer chain like an HB, or, one can handle acids better and one can handle sugar better. So you can have a mixed culture in certain systems as well. So the bacteria matters, the feedstock matters, the end use processing matters.
The Good Garbage podcast has been brought to you by PACA. PACA has been creating solutions in the food packaging, carry, and service space. PACA utilizes sugarcane residue and upcycles it into amazing products. Their latest offering is a compostable, flexible packaging solution for the chocolate and confectionery industry. The products are available in the Indian subcontinent and in North America now. PACA is also building an end-to-end solutions for customers in the food service and delivery space. For any query, do email at connect@paca.com, and PACA is PAKKA. Now, back to the show. Getting back to the original trajectory we were on, you become a biochemist, you go into your PhD, and you start working with companies. And then how does USDA happen? How do you move from this path of working with companies and move into the US Department of Agriculture and then ARS, which is Agricultural Research Services?
Yeah.
And, how does this shift happen in your life?
So I moved to USDA in a group that was trying to maximize the products from wheat and wheat starch. So we were everything. So the Western Center, in very simple terms, were everything not corn and soy. It was literally by commodities. So in the 90s, what's the best use for every other starch or specialty crop west of the Rockies, west of Chicago, corn, not soy, what's the best use for these? Roughly 25 plus years ago, we could build our own program. Now, remember, I'm a PHA lifer, and we had still worked on biopolymers. We can literally write our next 5-year project plan, and we said a biorefinery needs all of this. A biorefinery can't be just about corn ethanol. A biorefinery has to have a way to use every end-use product. You can produce methane and find better uses for methane. If you have excess sugar, if you have excess waste, excess starch. So we got into starch plastics. And again, what do you do with the rest of the stuff? Maybe you have sugars, you can make PHAs. We started working with folks on degradable plastics. And then we may have gotten a little bit outside the lines. We can help the community who's making PLA. So we became very good at bioplastics, a one-stop shop, where we became consultants to companies who wanted to make, and big and small, for about 10 to 15 years. So in getting good, we hope good, in getting useful in the bioplastic space and in the biorefinery space. So 1/3 of our group is biorefinery enzymes and cellulosic ethanol. 1/3 was strategic molecules. We'll talk about that if you want, natural rubber that you don't necessarily get from a rubber tree. And then 1/3 of us was bioplastics and biopolymers and bioproducts. All right. And they're almost one and the same project, or they're separate entities, depending on how you look at it. We wrote up that as our mission. And if we did it well, we can keep it being our mission, and we can help. And our mission was to help companies start across the valley of death and even get across the valley of death. Help companies in that, give them a reason to believe that you can at least make a prototype. So we set up a pilot plant where it's like, we believe that there's a greener way to do this. My belief that there's a natural product that don't over design. If you can minimize synthetic components, minimize them. Not that they're bad, but you don't know if they're good until you've tried. So if you can get back to natural products, use the natural products. So we grew a unit starting 25 years ago with a bunch of like-minded people that we're proud of. I'm proud of, at least. Now, what we've implied, it's been with mostly smaller companies. One of our first partners was a less small company called Chevron. When they were doing, their research center is only 8 miles up the road. So we supported a lot of alternative energy research with Chevron. Early on, Clorox, their international research headquarters is just up the road. And when Clorox was introducing the Greenworks, they would support two postdocs that reported to a senior fellow at Clorox Research and at the headquarters, and reported to me. And we would try to get our best ideas into Clorox products. So at the risk of, it's down to Kingsford charcoal. That's a Clorox. So charcoal, biggest brand in charcoal. We were pressing charcoal briquettes in our pilot plant with them. Glad bags. So we had a partnership between Metabolics and Glad to make the first compostable bags that we made into bags in our pilot plant over 15 years ago. Metabolics and us and Glad. Ziploc's been there as well. So, there's kitty litter. So Clorox brands have research for about 12 years in our pilot plant. And it was a lot of fun. Okay, so you want to know the transition. That's really, really fun to quietly have a say. And some of the same people that left Clorox helped be some of the early employees at Method Products, Method, Ecover, Mrs. Meyer's brands. And so when they were only a few people, some of their people, like Mango, when they were a few people, moved into our labs. And they did some of they still do it. They still have a lab in our building. Their main formulator, employee number 4, still from Mango and from Method, is still in our building running around. Now they're owned by SC Johnson. So SC Johnson brands. So we help little companies and big companies try to give them a reason to believe that you can make a more natural product.
Now, my question was totally different, but thank you for the whole trajectory. My question was, why did Bill Orts decide to go into USDA?
Yeah, so I decided because, first of all, the group was interesting. Greg Glenn was a partner who wanted to make starch plastics and didn't know about bioplastics, and he knew about my PHA background. So he wanted to make starch plastics, and would we make them blends? And he knew I knew about bioplastics and was into that crowd. The two of us, we were into ASTM standards on what's a degradable plastic. So when I interviewed, the other part of it is it's in Berkeley, California, and the weather's beautiful. And okay, so you came there, and I like, this is a really cool research center with a great pilot plant and a whole new chance to start a field from scratch almost. So what are we going to do in bioplastics? Novamont had just been born, and they were making starch plastics in Italy. So there were just companies internationally that were recognizing this, and I had some expertise, and they wanted it at USDA, and I wanted to go to, essentially Berkeley, California, and help start a group. And we grew quickly because we did okay. So we quietly grew with companies and had some successes.
And so just before we started the call, I know you mentioned that you are like the person for contact, like you used another term, but it was like 14 projects are what you're handling. So let's break down, like the USDA-ARS seems to be doing a lot of different areas in terms of tackling a lot of different areas. And you mentioned some while we've been talking, but how many of these areas are there? Can you bring in a list for us? What all does ARS do?
Oh, okay. So ARS, that too broad. ARS tries to do, if it's important in agriculture, they try to do it, and they usually do. It's a problem-solving organization that gives people a reason to believe that you can come up with a better idea. So ARS-wide, a third of our building is food safety, a third of our building is crop improvement, and the third is bioproducts or better foods. All right, healthier foods. So roughly one third. The healthier foods and our bioproducts, we're the non-food group, have pilot plants. And we give companies, somebody once said, a picture's worth 1,000 words, a prototype's worth 1,000 pictures. We help them come up with kind of like the first prototype if they're willing, and they can move in, at a very reasonable rent. We don't use the word rent. They can move in with us to be strategic partners, and we share resources. So we can point you to, so I'm on 14 projects. Some of them you can go out. So one that just closed down is World Centric. They make PLA forks. Well, we met them when they were, just a few people, and they did some of their first research. Now, we're not going to take credit for their success, but their first PLA forks and knives and spoons with the whole was done in our pilot plant. So some of their early research of companies like that, we give them access to resources and equipment that they might not, they don't have to get from scratch. So some of the first PLA manufacturers. So even though PLA is manufactured in the Midwest, most of the companies are Western based. and nearby us. So maybe the California market was more open to them. So the other project that is near and dear to my heart that I'm not the main lead on is strategic molecules and rubber, which has grown into castor oil originally and rubber. Now it's almost all rubber. So we lead a project to make all natural domestically produced rubber. Rubber you could produce anywhere in the world. You don't necessarily have to go to the tropics. It was the last thing that Thomas Edison was working on as he passed away is, can we get an American source of rubber or rubber that can be produced in a moderate climate rather than tropical? All right. So we have a 30-year, 40-year project in which we make rubber from either dandelions or more recently, and more importantly for us, a desert shrub called waiuli. And instead of tapping a rubber tree, you basically get these stalks that have anywhere from 6 to 12% rubber in the stem, and you extract it out. And you try for plants that you can. So dandelions, you take the root. So we're trying for crops that you would grow in the U.S. Without having to go tap a rubber tree in the tropics. And it's not just academic. Our consortium has worked with all the major tire companies, Bridgestone, Firestone, to put out we have a Cooper tire that's gone to market that's produced from a desert shrub. Firestone has racing tires and demo tires, and it's a USDA project that the research side is run out of our group. And then, okay, so I just said something important. 10% rubber, right? In the stem. What do you do with the other 90%? There's your biorefinery built in. So out the back of out of your plant, a bunch of bagasse sticks, what do you do with that pile of biomass? And then that triggers the other 2/3 of our projects. Okay, you got rubber out of the first 10%. You try to make a tire. You can make hypoallergenic gloves from latex that don't cause allergies. And they're out in the marketplace. So what am I PI on? Not on that one. And the other thing we're working on is all the additives, either in plastics. Okay, so now I can go on a rant for hours. Bioplastics has slightly gotten a bad name lately because, some of these environmental groups are looking at the final product and they go, oh, they weren't as healthy as they could be or should be. They're just as unhealthy as synthetic plastics. And then they'll say a PLA plastic or a starch plastic wasn't good, showed environmental toxicology. Well, 100% of the time, it's been the additives. Like they'll say oh, a PLA-based plastic has a nasty result in an environmental test. And you look, it's not the PLA, folks. It's what you did as an additive. And so we've been working for the last 15 years on safer plant-based additives. The plant bottle from Coca-Cola, we worked a little bit with them to advise them on additives you could add that are better. So get rid of really bad plasticizers, UV stabilizers, antioxidants, and get to more natural additives, or get rid of the additives completely. So I can go on and on for that. We do that in tires as well. What are all the additives in tires? Are there safer ones? And can they be more natural?
When we were comparing PLA and PHA, we forgot one angle. What about cellulosic films? How do you compare those with those substrates that you mentioned before?
So that's one of my projects I just inherited. One of the ones I inherited is taking banknotes and finding the best end use of a banknote. Okay, so we have a group. I'm going to say something sacrilegious. I don't know if you've ever heard of cellulose, nanocellulose. All right, cellulose nanocrystals.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's an old saying that you can make anything out of lignin but money. And it's starting to be a little bit like that with nanocellulose. You can make anything out of nanocellulose, but nobody's made money quite yet. And I think it's feedstock costs. To our group, another part of our side group for the last 10 years, find the feedstock, maybe that someone will pay you, and we'll support any company that works on this, where the life cycle analysis pans out and you can make money on the feedstock. And the one source that we found is we found out that the Bureau of Engraving pays to get rid of banknotes, right? They have to be carefully scrutinized, but we're feds. So we have a partnership with them. They might be the source of cellulose instead of paying, $40 a ton to get rid of them, because most, so banknotes go somewhere, right? When you're, at least in the United States, they're usually caught in some cellulose, very cellulose rich streams. You got a lot of cellulose in there, and then they get collected by the central banks and shredded under heavy security. But then you have a pile of biomass that's very rich in cellulose and some strange inks and a few other things, right? Is that the perfect feedstock for a nanocellulose or some kind of new cellulose? And we've been working on that one. That's exciting. Or anywhere else, like that's one of the reasons that intrigued us when we were working with the landfill folks that steam treat garbage. You can get a cellulose rich stream from that. And so if someone's paying you a starting point $100 a ton to get rid of garbage, you have a $100 head start to maybe get to a cellulose rich stream.
I'll give you one more. So we use in our process, we use sugarcane residue bagasse. And we have to remove all the parenchyma kind of cells, which is the pith. And the pith is 78% holocelluloses. So the challenge, of course, is that it's difficult to make alpha cellulose out of it because you can't really pulp it. So, but then if we have a mind like yours, I'm sure we can figure out something to extract the nanocelluloses because it's already very small particles. It's powder, literally.
I mean, I'm sure the answer is there. The biggest problem with ag is that it happens out in the country. So you probably have enough bagasse, but it's not necessarily near a processing plant. Who's going to make the commitment? So that is a part of who's going to collect the feedstock and make a big enough plant to make money from that. And that seems to be, so in sugarcane's a good one because you do collect the bagasse and you'd have it in a big pile out back. The only problem with sugarcane, that bagasse goes bad too quickly. So you're exactly thinking the way we think. That is an incredible opportunity you have. But within that opportunity, the logistics, as soon as you go, okay, originally that's a really great opportunity, but who's going to store the bagasse and make sure it doesn't start fermenting under the hot sun? And you go, okay, if we could only get that and store it all year and just put out a little bit of nanocellulose, the same amount every day, you have the solution. And I believe there are solutions. It's just somebody's got to make the first plant that works.
Oh, we've been doing that for like 40 years. So we now in India, we have a plant that uses about 300,000 tons of bagasse. And the sugar season is only 4 months. So you have to collect the rest and it stays for 8 months. So there are two ways to keep it. You either keep it in wet piles or you dry it out. When you dry it out, then it becomes a fire hazard. And it also, the morphology changes and, you don't get the right cellulosic structures. So typically we keep it in huge wet piles, but we do de-pith it before putting it in those wet piles. And we are setting up a plant in Guatemala right now, which is 500,000 tons. So, but similar idea. So we have been storing it for a long, long time. We don't want to use a fresh bagasse because we realize that it still has a lot of sugar content. So we actually condition it for 3 months. We keep it in piles before we actually use it in our plant.
Are you hinting? So the world leaders that we turn to are Praj. Okay, they're one of the world's leaders that we notice.
Yeah.
And so what they do in India, can it be copied out here in California? Can it be copied? Yeah. I mean, I'm very aware.
I don't know about, or Louisiana, it can be done.
Yeah, could it be copied in Louisiana and would they copy it, right? So our centers were set up by Commodity 90 years ago, okay? And Louisiana has a building, exact same floor plan as ours, the Southern Lab, we're in the Western Lab, and their specialty is sugarcane and bagasse. So your question is really, really intriguing, but by congressional mandate almost, we're less likely to work on sugarcane. We're going to work on wheat straw, rice straw, right? And then Louisiana can work on rice straw, but it's by commodity. They're going to work on sugarcane and cotton because they're down in the South. So their group didn't necessarily go in this same direction, but they should. I agree with you. And maybe, somebody like a Praj can teach them the best way to handle this.
Yeah, no, Praj has definitely done some good jobs, but again, there are some of us out there who've been trying to make our set of mistakes to learn and grow, make more mistakes kind of thing. So you learn over time.
Yeah. And going back to the refinery model, the fact that they can get, and this is why, the reason why corn ethanol succeeded in the United States is they can sell corn syrup to our food industry all the time. And the reason you potentially can set up a biorefinery off the back of a sugar, you're getting revenue day to day, right? That's predictable. And then you can build the biorefinery off the back and do really cool stuff like you're suggesting. But you need, the head start the oil industry has is the first 80% of that petroleum is going to go to gasoline and jet fuel. And they're making money every day. And then they can get really sophisticated on what else to do as they separate things.
Yeah, so the other thing you mentioned in the middle was crystalline nanocelluloses. So I've seen two methodologies, and I agree with you. The only thing you don't make is money out of that. So, but the two methods where we've got enormous success recently, and I was going to get into that, so I'll get into that one domain, which I'm going to mention now, is that there are two methodologies, fundamentally, going more mechanical or going more chemical. And we've recently been working with an Israeli company, and the best water vapor barrier that we have as a barrier coating is actually from CNCs now. And it's not as cost effective as we would like it to be, but it's still not at the scale we would like it to be. They're able to do chemical modification and extract CNC, which has made it much easier, because earlier you would just grind and make this into this gooey gel, and then yes, you could use it. So just coming to barriers in particular, what do you think, and especially as a PHA lifer, because we have a lot of hope there. We feel that that may be, and we work closely with RWDC as well, and we feel that PHA might have the holy grail to crack that code on a water vapor barrier and really close that sheet. What do you think of that? And in comparison to CNCs, how do you see that?
So you just nailed one of the projects I'm on, is barrier coatings, and can we find the right nanocrystal formulation, and is it commercially available? I'm all ears when you're talking about this. So you can imagine everybody wants a coating. Polyvinyl alcohol, PVA, goes so far. Been the workhorse of the coating industry, especially on papers and things and barriers. Can you match it, and can you use less materials? And then, of course, everyone's going to notice the PFAS alternatives. I mean, if you get commercial, you will make money on that. I like where you're going, what you're suggesting on coatings. We agree completely. We were pointed to also a Finnish group that makes good coatings. So there's several groups that treat this as a coating. We're also looking in our field in general for natural adhesives that could potentially be home compostable. The more and more, the less synthetic materials or petroleum derived materials we can get in adhesives, we have more opportunities there as well.
So let's stay with barriers a little bit, because this is always a burning topic. So the way we look at it, as an PVA has also got the challenge. So PVA still works with a oxygen kind of barrier. We find that moisture barrier is still kind of lacking when you use PVA, and you have to use cross linkers, and the challenge becomes repulpability as well. It tends to coagulate. So that's few of the challenges, especially when you're running a paper-based substrate, which, there will be what they call broke, and there would be slab-offs, and you have to bring it back into pulping. So that's one of the challenges with PVA. Less moisture barrier and also repulpability. But then you typically, what we've found is that you have to at least have two functional coatings, even if you do PVA as a primer. And at least what we find is the two very interesting ones are in the nanocellulosic space and the bioacrylic space, the bio-based acrylics. So if you were to formulate a holy grail with whatever work you are doing, what would your structure look like if you have to come to that under 5 moisture barrier or less even?
Well, I mean, you said it about 2 minutes ago, and RWDC comes to mind. So there's probably a perfect PHA material for your packaging. You within the mechanical space, temperature and flexibility space, there's probably a PHA that works for your packaging need. You don't need to metal coat Mylar to make a drink packet. You can probably find a PHA somewhere that will do that, but it's about barriers. So the perfect world is probably a PHA, the perfect PHA at the right cost that competes with some kind of barrier coating. We've been involved, and we get asked questions by companies. More and more companies are worried about PVA coatings and laundry pods. Okay, so we have a lot of respirometers in our building. So we answer questions with companies. So some of the things we'll do, and we'll ask just if anybody asks us nicely, we'll run a respirometer, running ocean water, bay water, sludge, sewage sludge, or we'll do ASTM D6400s. We just do it directionally. So we have about 160 respirometry channels, and then we have poor man respirometers, which is just basically bottles with a CO2 sensor on top. We count the carbons coming off bottles. Okay, why are we doing that? Because people are questioning whether PVA is really ocean safe. And I'm not necessarily going to say I'm going to answer that. Okay, so it's not for me to decide, it's for the market to decide, or others, or environmental toxicology. But they're coming to us and saying, we have done PVAs in certain tests, and we're not convinced it's the right outer coating for a laundry pod. And we're like, okay, that's your gig, but have you thought about other things? And this is where you just nailed it. There's a market right there that you just suggested as well. Paper coatings, everywhere you put a PVA, can you come up with a thinner coating? And then eventually, everywhere you put PFAS, the ultimate dream is a popcorn bag that is all natural. Is it paper-based with some coating with, does it have a PHA, nanocellulose coating that allows you to put it in the microwave and not require PFAS and put out perfect, popcorn or other hot bags.
Let's stay with PFAS. We mentioned this, and of course, we both heard it a lot. I see this as very, very interesting. Of course, you have PFAS in water, right? And so if you're using water for your chemistry, you might get some PFAS. And of course, you don't want to add any forever chemicals to your product, but talk to me a little more on the molded fiber side, because that's something that's got a lot of flack recently, especially for their OGR, grease resistance chemistry. Yeah. And most of those chemicals had some traces of PFAS, and they're trying to eliminate those. But what I found is that when you actually test the product, because you say you're using a 1% of a chemical that has traces of PFAS, whenever we test the product, we don't get any PFAS kind of visible. But the law tells the producers that you cannot add it. It does not matter whether it's visible or not. Whereas if you test a simple drinking water, there is PFAS. So how do you see it? And I don't want you to get political around it, but no. How do you see it as a scientist that, how does one solve that challenge?
So first of all, the safe limits are getting down towards where we can barely measure them. And then you make assumptions. Is it total fluorine, or do you actually recognize that it was PFAS, right? Especially in municipalities that put fluorine in their drinking water. So, and then you're going to measure total fluorine. There's ways to get around all that. You asked a huge question. So rather than get political about it, recycled fiber. There's no simple answers. Is what eventually I can rant for a couple of minutes, but there's no simple answers on this. One of the ones that was a major gotcha, though, with molded pulp was not only the fact that they tried to use recycled pulp and, PFAS would carry into it. PFAS might be in the water, but even some of the processing aids, companies would say, oh, we weren't intentionally adding it, but mold release agents. 10 years ago, most of the chain oil at the Tour de France was a PFAS lubricant. I mean, PFAS lubricants and processing aids were everywhere in the industry, and they're not even thought about. So if you get a spray bottle and you want, if you want your bicycle to run smoothly, get the really expensive stuff and you're spraying it with PFAS. If you want a mold release, if you want your plates to come off or whatever, and your cup to come out of your cup molder, spray everything in the system, spray your building with some kind of, lubricant that's probably got a fluorine in there. So it was or has been everywhere in places people didn't realize. And they only realized it almost on the gotchas that you implied. Like, we did everything possible. We asked our supplier for perfect pulp and still we found it. And then you have to question everything.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a forever chemical. It's going to be with us, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's you're right. It's a tough challenge to kind of solve, and I guess you have to be on the side of caution rather than otherwise. And I guess that's what's leading to a lot of the policies. And I wanted to pick your brains also on how familiar are you with the EU policies now on bioplastics and biopolymers, and if you have a view on that, because they are going down to the again exactly what you were saying before, what is a natural substance and what is not, and they've literally classified PLA is not. So because it does act like polypropylene and the molecular structure is like that. So do you have a view on that?
So I'm aware of EU policy. So if we're doing our job well, and we've been really lucky, there's a guy named Andrew Stevens at the Foreign Ag Service who is quietly, again, you might not see this on social media, quietly a world expert on policy around plastics. And so he brings people together and tries to make sense of all the different rules. Andrew Stevens, Foreign Ag Service. I'll digress for a second. But in California, two jurisdictions 20 miles apart can give away, one jurisdiction will give you the little plastic bags and the holders for your kitchen waste, and it'll be, probably some PLA green bag, and you put your kitchen waste. And 20 miles down the highway, they will not allow those in their compost facility and ban them and tell you you're not allowed to use them. So we need, even statewide, within a 10-minute, 20-minute drive, right, you can have different answers. So how do you, deal with this on a national level? So the EU single-use home compostable laws that might come in by January has affected us. It's one of the projects that I inherited, again, right down to the product lookup stickers. Okay, so the little nasty little stickers you can see on an apple. So it saves a lot of packages. Okay, so you go in the United States, and like our standard grocery store, instead of packaging something like an apple in a plastic bag that uses a lot of packaging, or a tray that uses a lot of packaging, that also wastes a lot of fruit. So you put a little single sticker the size of your thumb on there that's got the PLU. Saves a lot of supply chain headaches, saves a lot of everything. And you can sell 10 different types of apples at different prices, organic and everything, because of that little PLU. The question is, if Europe says everything has to be home compostable, does that entire sticker have to be home compostable? We got brought into that policy question. As scientists, can we make, so we work with the world leader of making those PLU stickers. They quickly found films that are home compostable. Inks is not a big problem. It's the adhesive and whether that matters. So that's been the big headache. And they want to know about EU policy. So single-use items, maybe you can get away a lot of times without packaging. That might be it. Like every single use. So maybe the preservatives and packaging, you can use more paper, you can use those little lookup stickers, or you can use a tin can for snacks, or, think differently. Just, your peanuts, your snack could come in a soda can instead of a plastic bag, perhaps.
Yeah, you have to think from the first principles angle rather than just thinking, okay, we need a material which is a replacement, rather than, what do you really want to achieve is the question. Yeah.
And going back, and maybe the gotcha moment about bioplastics are greenwashing sometimes, is I think that early on, the folks who tried to introduce bioplastic, the formulators, try to make it match polypropylene. Okay, I'm going to, and I need to make all the additives, or I've got to use all the, processing aids and formulators and antioxidants, or whatever, you fill in the blank, to make it look like my polypropylene, polyethylene blend, whatever, coming off the line. And so in doing that, you use additives that you have on hand that you're used to. And you use all the tricks that you would use in synthetic polymers to make it look like, but it doesn't necessarily have to look like the polypropylene bag you're replacing.
Yeah, I agree. So circling back, you earlier mentioned the inspiration from nature, right, early in our conversation. The way I've seen it is the building blocks are so simple, right? It's carbohydrates and amino acids mainly. And then, of course, a small part of the periodic table and some minerals, and you have amazing products coming out. So I would love for you to address that two building blocks and how do you see that? And the other one, non sequitur in some ways, is I saw a fascinating article which you were involved with, and that was on the chitin side, which is mostly proteins. And then utilizing something like an amino acid and then creating structures, because again, you see fascinating structures in nature which are more protein based. So how do you see those two substrates and then building blocks for the future?
Your introduction was perfect, right? They are the natural building blocks, and nature's dealt with them. So you're not introducing something that hasn't. So we've, millennia, our ecosystem, our biodiversity has dealt with those building blocks. So something breaks down, the amino acids can break down. We know nature knows what to do with them, and all the way down the whole food chain, they deal with them. I'm going to not answer your question and say the thing we're most excited about. It's now a 7-year-old idea. There's there's a guy named Billy Hart Cooper in our group. We met him through the Berkeley Center for Green Chemistry, and I give a lecture on these natural building blocks. Okay. And we met him through that. And he came out with a brilliant idea to the point where we decided we have to hire this person. And that is that there's the chance in nature that we don't use enough in chemistry, reversible bonds, shift-based bonds. So if you want to make, and our first success with him was antibiotic agents, but it could be, and the second one is in sunscreens. So things called shift bases, which is between a nitrogen and a carbon kind of thing, you can reverse them at different pHs or different concentrations. So when I hang around with Billy, I do a lot of this, okay? You can start with a natural product, something as simple as cinnamon oil. You can start with an amino acid product. Those both might be antimicrobials, but not perfect ones. You put them together through this chemistry, and the antimicrobial behavior goes up 1,000-fold or more. But then you add water or you change the pH and they fall back apart to cinnamon oil and amino acid. And that pair of building blocks is the thing I'm most excited about. I hope, my career lasts long enough that I get to see Billy get his due on that, because we were brought in with a home care company worried about sunscreen and sunscreens that might stick to coral reefs. And we're like, you need the sunscreen to fall apart. That's what you need. You just need, like, you're a single-use item. Okay, you have a relationship with this sunscreen. You put it on your skin. You want it to be really natural stuff, but you also want it to block the sun. And say this kind of reversible chemistries, when it's highly concentrated on your skin, it's doing something, and then it falls apart back to natural ingredients. And then when it's in the ocean, it's natural ingredients again. That's the most exciting thing within your question about building blocks, is what new you can do with it, and reversible chemistries or not permanent chemistries. The opposite of forever chemicals, the opposite of PFAS. If you have a single-use item, make sure that product only lasts a little longer than you need it.
And what do you think about solvents in nature? So nature fundamentally has one solvent, green chemistry. So it's all water. But as soon as we get into the process side, and sometimes we talk very little of it, right? We can talk about a product, whether it's degradable, compostable, not degradable, but we may have used a lot of harmful solvents producing it. So how do you see shifting more towards water-based chemistry and enzymes and that sort of thing? And do you think that's going to happen in the near future?
So our enzyme team would dream it's going to happen. Okay, so yeah, anything you can do with enzymes specifically is a win, right? And so we have our team, trying to make nylons for a while using enzymatic roots, mostly water-based, just like you said. Yeah, I mean, there's a whole world of solvents, and they do carry into the plastics. So one of the things, we've had a lot of drivers in dealing with bioplastics, market drivers. What's going to get this to capture the market, or what are the reasons? Why would you make a bioplastic? And the one that we've been also working on, besides the additives, is the bioaccumulative nature of plastics. They accumulate stuff. So one that catches people's attention, a slightly controversy, it's not whether you're going to ingest a microplastic. Okay, kind of now it's going to get in your body. You're going to breathe it. If you're going to eat a microplastic, which one do you want to eat? And if you start thinking, reverse the question like that, you might behave differently. And you might not want a nasty solvent like, oh yeah, we made polyacrylamide and we only left a fraction of a percent acrylamide in it. Okay, but right. So, I mean, yeah, I don't want that fraction of a percent of a residue. Now, that was the worst nasty case, and polyacrylamide doesn't stick around long enough. Anyway, but those are the sorts of questions that you would raise yourself. If you knew you were eating a microplastic, which ones do you want? Most of the bioplastics that are out on the market, caprolactone, all of them, they start out as medical implants, and they are your sutures, they are bone grafts. And there's medical data that says you can absorb them very safely down to elemental. So the danger is not PLA can be used, PLA cousins. All of the sutures and bone grafts are your biopolymers. So there's enough I'd rather have that in my body than a PFAS sticking around. The other thing, so if you can make the additive safe and you accumulate that, there's medical data that says your body can absorb that as a bone graft. So, okay, that's that natural thing again. So try to make the additives as natural as possible. And then when you're ingesting it, and now going back to your nasty solvents, yeah, I mean, a lot of those, that goes back to that other idea. A lot of the molecules that ended up as solvents were throwaway molecules from the refinery industry. So they're going to be out there, and they were much cheaper, and you could build a plant and recycle. So the chemical engineers were really, really good at their job through the 50s, 60s, and 70s and making very efficient plants that beat out water, which has an awkward melting point or boiling point or whatever. It steams off. So the solvents work. But now we're starting to think, where does the solvent go? Man, it comes back to the question, if you're going to eat a microplastic, which ones do you want to eat? It's a nasty question.
I've never thought about it like that, but that's wonderfully put. Okay, you are going to get it in your body, so what do you want in it?
What do you want in there? And what do your kids want? And if you're going to hug them in a polyester sweater, do you want a flame retardant against your shirt, right? What flame retardant do you want? You have to envy. I know we don't want our clothes to catch on fire, but what do you want to hug them with?
Yeah. So I know that we have to take this conversation, as wonderful as it is, towards closure. But there is one more area I wanted to pick your brains on, and it has been intriguing me for a while. And that is to do with foaming. So if you look at, I find polystyrene and expanded polystyrene to be a fascinating substrate just for the versatility of it. But of course, we can't have that. But when you look at nature, there is so much interesting foaming. So we worked a little bit, and why I'm bringing this up is because we worked a little bit with PLA and foaming PLA, and it was interesting. You could create structures. So do you see a future where we can create more akin to natural foams that would disintegrate eventually, like you said, soon after usage? How do you see that part, the foaming?
Okay. So now this is a very big question you asked, and I mentioned my partner in crime, Greg Glenn. So the reason he invited me to the group was he was trying to replace styrofoam cups with starch foams. That was the original project. Okay. And so we got a cup molder from one of the big cup makers, Dixie, whatever, and we were making little starch foams. And what would you do to literally make them into drop-in replacements for styrofoam in a molding factory? So we got very good. Now, we never what it eventually led to is the sidebar, is the little foam particles that you get in Clorox versions of kitty litter. We helped them get the little blue smell beads that are in Scoop Away and Fresh Step, and it ended up working with Method in their laundry products. Okay, so we got pretty good at making starch and polysaccharide foams. I love your idea. I mean, it's really useful. Surface area matters. And then sometimes our best ideas are other people's. A company now it's called Coriomat with Mike Wagner. Check them out in that they have, it's kind of intriguing that you mentioned that you got success with PLA foams. We definitely see a role for that. At Coriomat, again, they had us on Hello, showed up with a foam. Mike Wagner's their founder. He hates calling it foams because then you think of styrofoam. He likes calling it, airier or, structured. But basically, it was with kind of just mechanical pressure, like almost high temperature, high pressure kind of stuff. And you get the foams without additives. And that's why we liked him. All right. I'm sort of didn't answer your question, except that I'm intrigued by your question. There's definitely room for lots of takeaways there.
Yeah, and I've also had, there's a very interesting company, I think it's called Star Fiber, if my memory serves me right. And that was doing starches and celluloses. And it was, again, creating foam structures, foam from exactly what you were talking about, foam from starches, but reinforced cellulosic fibers. It's very interesting. And I loved I saw their cups and their trays, and it was pretty interesting. And anyways, an area to be explored because I just feel it's such a versatile usage, say in a beverage cup. If you do a paper beverage cup, you're talking about a cup stock with a certain amount of coating and then a bottom and then a ripple get deck on the top to save it from heat. And then you have this solo structure, which is already really good with handling heat from an insulation property. So I keep wondering, how does one solve that challenge without getting into a complex structure like a paper cup? So yeah, that's been on my radar.
It's a good one to have on your radar. Yeah. I mean, think how frustrating it is for Starbucks to keep selling those stupid sleeves so you don't burn your hand.
Exactly.
Right. So they need a cup, and they're getting there, that doesn't use those sleeves or other.
They have the cup challenge ongoing. I hope that they'll find interesting products. Okay,
Right.
taking us towards curve towards closure. How does a company get to work with you? What is the process? If any of our listeners, and a lot of our listeners are companies in the packaging kind of space, and how would they come to you and say that, hey, Bill, help us?
Okay. Just say that. Hey, Bill. Well, not necessarily help them. We can, we learn from them. So my email, bill.orts@usda.gov. So bill.orts@usda.gov. Send an email, invite yourself over, start a Zoom conversation, and ask. We can match notes. We learn from you. You learn from us. Do we have equipment that you want to borrow, use, come and try? Can we help you? We don't necessarily, we've been known to get on grants with folks or help them get through small business grants. We hope that they do most of the writing because, like I said, I'm on 14 projects. I don't want to write, 14 more grants. Quick answer is just send us an email and see if we can help or see if we want to, partner together. Our partner, so notice I've never used the word incubator. Some people will say you kind of run an incubator there because we've had a lot of companies come through. We're not allowed to call it incubator because it's sort of strategic and by invitation only. And that's because they have to be within our congressional mandate. But then we try to write our congressional mandate so that we have a big umbrella. But we can't just take on any taker unless it fits our strategy. Now, I ranted about a lot of things today. So you notice we try to make our mission as broad as we can in that natural space. But we're not allowed to be called an incubator because it has to be strategic partnerships. Therefore, the companies that come to us aren't paying rent in an incubator. They're partners.
Fascinating. I'm intrigued. I'm definitely going to learn more about this process because I just think there is so much strength in people coming together and collaborating and exploring and finding solutions together. And you clearly have a wealth of knowledge out there. So it's fascinating to see.
Well, it's from talking with folks like you and others that come through the door. And I try to learn every day. Yeah. So I try to, meet with folks who are the live minds in the industry and learn things. And then potentially connect them. That's another role we do. So sometimes the solutions we've had nothing to do with us, right? Except that we just said, like you were saying about nanocrystals as a coating. Well, I don't know what you just said, but I know somebody who wants it. So if you link me to a company and they want it, matchmaking.
Absolutely. I think that's one of my father's mentors used to say, to connect is divine.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it stuck with me, and it just came back as you said, matchmaking. He said that's God's work. You connect things.
Wow.
Okay, my last two. So tell me the projects that you're most excited about right now, and in long, that's it's a little bit of unpacking the question you're excited about and are scalable. So something that is going to change the world and you're excited about.
Okay. So the project, our lead scientist on it, Colleen McMahon, is domestic rubber production is being scaled as we speak. And so Rubber production really depends on people being paid, very low wages to go collect a tin can of rubber sap from the tropics. Okay. If people want living wages, the price of rubber is going to go up. And there's a lot of carbon miles on that. So getting a domestic supply, getting rubber produced anywhere in the world is a biggie. And then being able, you can't drive a car or fly a plane without natural rubber. So the tires have to have some natural rubber in them. And then all the economies of the world are driving more cars than bicycles now and using more rubber, and there's fewer rubber plantations. So I'm very excited about expanding opportunities to produce rubber. We just have to do it. And then the second one is that, well, I have a lot. All of our babies are precious, but that self-assembly I talked about, getting more needs for that, getting it out into product. And literally there's companies wanting to use that. And that's about getting it EPA and FDA, registered and out there as an antimicrobial agent. That self-assembly, and then expanding that to everything like additives. That the companies we've worked with 3 different companies on that, are working on scale up. That is scalable. These reversible chemistries I just talked about, we've gotten to scale on 3 different of the products, which again, part of my job is I don't brag about that stuff because I didn't just tell you who those companies are, right? So we keep a fairly low profile. We could brag more, but when you come to visit, you'll see that we're proud of what we do. So we brag our share. So how do you work with us? If you get to the San Francisco Bay Area, Berkeley area, invite yourself over too. Anybody out there.
Well, I'm taking that offer for sure. I hope other listeners would as well. So the other one, as you were talking about rubber, and this came to me earlier and I didn't mention it, but I should. I hope that my friend and one of our mentors is a professor at Jerusalem University called Orts. Remarkable stuff. And I don't know if you've seen his TED talk, but it's about injecting collagens into a tobacco plant and how he grew it and extracted it back. Very similar to what you were talking about in some ways, but fascinating stuff. And he was early on the show. I think maybe episode 2 or 3 even. So but it's fascinating what he did with the collagens there.
Yeah. So we have a tissue culture plant group that I'm sure is aware of that. Yeah. And then reimagining a landfill would be the third project, right? Or what is the future biorefineries that already exist? How can you do more with a landfill or a wastewater treatment facility plant? Well, let's move a mango plant more and more. Now they're at 2 waste treatment facilities, but can you put something like a mango plant next to a landfill or next to a wastewater treatment facility and have that scale? And anything we can do to help something like that. Let's use up those carbons in a better way.
Super. And that takes me to my final question. What does good garbage mean to you?
So it means closing the loops and making sure they don't turn into landfill gas, greenhouse gases. Landfill gas does not become a greenhouse gas. So good garbage means using those carbons more responsibly and making money for folks. Why not? Right. So, treating something like a landfill or a wastewater treatment plant as a source of revenue beyond just dumping stuff on the side of a hill. That's good garbage.
This has been such a wide-ranging and fascinating conversation. I'm sure we've gone all over the map and then I've tried to bring it back, but then my brain was going, ask this. And I literally started because there was such little available online. I started with such a short page of kind of questions that I'm going to ask you. And you should see my page now. It's just like, boom, as you're talking. So fascinating to hear all the stuff that you've been doing in and I'm sure your team's own way. You're changing the world in so many ways. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing what you're doing. And thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for that compliment. We try. I enjoy my work.
Thank you for listening to the Good Garbage Podcast. Follow us on social media to never miss an episode. Links are in the description below. I'm your host, Ved Krishna. See you next time.